Callie and I are PhD students at ASU, and we're in our second year of PhD coursework. And one of the things we've been talking about is basically how relevant history is in the 21st century, although that's not always immediately obvious or realized. But one of the ways to kind of start to understand the relevance of history is to think about the ways in which history is used. So kind of as an introduction, Jill Lepore, who's a historian at Harvard, and who is very much invested in writing for a public audience, published a book last year in 2010 entitled The Whites of Their Eyes. And she's responding to basically to the 21st century, the Tea Party movement, the conservative movement, and basically she uses their misuse of history as a starting point. But what she's really interested in is the unending battle over American history. So Lepore is interested in the way that over 200 years later, the memory of the revolution has spurred two very different moments, different movements at different moments in time. In the 1970s, with the bicentennial, there were a lot of real debates, contentious debates about what the revolution meant, what it meant for American history. A part of that was a liberal group, the Tax Equity for Americans, or T, party emerged, and then of course in the 21st century, there's the conservative Tea Party movement that we're all aware of. And while not all Tea Partiers know this, officially T is also an acronym for taxed enough already. So two very different acronyms, different types of movements that have both been very invested in using the revolution to kind of legitimate themselves through historical arguments. Lepore also shows, however, that both movements have used these historical arguments that were, at worst, just plain inaccurate, or at best, misleading and deliberately out of context. So if Callie and I, 10 years ago, sat in front of a room full of people, maybe not adults, but for sure high school students and college students, and made a case for the relevance of history in the 21st century, it's quite likely that we would have gotten a lot of glazed eyes and even some scoffing. And not just because Callie and I would have been in high school at the time. But I think that the situation is slightly different now, because the Tea Party has put its interpretation of history, of American history, center stage in promoting their agenda. And then of course, other groups have then responded in kind, and it's once again kind of become a battle over historical interpretations. Now, Lepore talks a lot about, in researching her book, she's based in Boston, so she went to a whole lot of Tea Party meetings, and she noticed that it became very common in starting these meetings to say, for the speaker to say something like, "I want to give you all a little history lesson." And then, of course, that was the starting point for a discussion about what that means in terms of their political agenda. And then, of course, a really well-known example of this is Glenn Beck's TV show, which now is no longer on Fox, but when it was on Fox, he presents himself as a history teacher with a chalkboard, glasses, the whole bit. And so he's really, and he bases his arguments on his historical interpretation. And one of the things Lepore talks about is that in some sense there was so much going on in the Revolutionary period, and there were so many different figures that you can make, that there are a whole lot of claims, historical claims, that you can make and show some evidence for. But it's also important to realize that there are some claims that just cannot be made because the evidence isn't there. So she points out some irresponsible uses. She does this on both sides, the right and the left. But for example, she quotes Glenn Beck saying that George Washington was staunchly opposed to socialism, which is a historical argument that doesn't really work because socialism was a concept that was not even around in the 18th century. So he wouldn't have even have conceived of socialism as an entity to support or reject.
All right, so I'm going to pick up from here, and just want to be clear that we're not trying to make a political argument here. We're just showing the ways in which history has been used. It's been politicized in order to support particular agendas, and that what we'd like to achieve is to, at least for more people, to start thinking about history and the ways in which people use history and how that has implications for the way that we live today. And so Michelle Bachmann, in January of this year, caught a lot of bad press for her American history flubs. And one particular gaffe was about the founding fathers and slavery. And so by looking at what she said, it gives us an opportunity to see firsthand the dangers of ahistorical thinking. And I'm just going to read what she said. We know there was slavery that was still tolerated when the nation began. We know that was an evil, and it was a scourge and a blot and a stain on our history. But we also know that the very founders who wrote those documents worked tirelessly until slavery was no more in the United States. I think it is high time we recognize the contribution of our forebears who worked tirelessly, men like John Quincy Adams, who I think was just a child at this time, who would not rest until slavery was extinguished in this country. So really, the problem here is not that she's making a reference to the founding fathers and slavery, but that she's oversimplifying this relationship that the founders had with slavery. Because as an aside, there were some founders like John Jay who did work tirelessly, but many others, as you know, and namely Thomas Jefferson, were slaveholders. So the way we should think about the founders is more about compromise and what these men were willing to compromise in order to achieve a vision. There was no such kind of resolute dedication to equality or what Michelle Bachmann is trying to kind of oversimplify here. They were real, fallible human beings, not this kind of godlike class of men with a superhuman commitment to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But additionally, so that was kind of a long aside, she also failed to convey the hard truths that part of what made this great American experiment possible was slave labor. And so economically it made America viable, and the political and legal codes that were in place made this possible. So.
And so kind of this whole group of examples show us a number of things. First of all, the significance of historical interpretations for our political and cultural realities now. When politicians especially, politics is kind of the easy example, but when politicians utilize a particular historical interpretation, it can tell us a lot about, it's utilized for a particular political agenda and also for a particular for particular cultural ideas. They're interested in what it means to be American, what America as a nation represents. So those kinds of ideas have real implications. They also show these examples also show, however, that contrary to some perceptions, that history really isn't about the rote memorization of facts and figures. These stories and these issues aren't over. History is constantly being. Cali and I talked about the word revisionism as if it's a bad word, but that's very much a part of the process of learning history. Is William Faulkner said, "The past isn't dead; it isn't even past." So, I think something that's important to think about is the way in which that these interpretations are still contested and still relevant. But these examples also show, somewhat ironically, examples of ahistorical thinking, as Cali said. So this shows that just using historical references doesn't mean that we're thinking historically, that we're engaging in historical thinking. In fact, Lepore characterizes the Tea Party's use of history as anti-history, in which, and some of the ways she characterizes this is time is an illusion. It's as if either we're back then or the founders are here. When there's comments about Benjamin Franklin or whoever would be rolling over in their graves, that's as if Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson or whoever, in his time, in his cultural context, political context, could relate directly to the situation as if there hasn't been 200 years in between. So that's one of Lepore's critiques. And then what really speaks to what Callie is saying is that this sort of anti-history really doesn't have any patience for the kind of attention to ambiguity and contradiction that is just so inherent to historical thinking and historical understanding. And then also the final characteristic of this anti-history is an unclear and sometimes non-existent standard of evidence. So kind of countering this ahistorical thinking with historical thinking is really important to Callie and I's project.
Yeah, and so something to think about is why there's such a lack of historical thinking in, I guess, in the 21st century. And there are walls that kind of have been intentionally created between academic historians, so professionally trained historians, and just a popular reading public. Some of the things that are barriers between academic history and a general audience are things like jargon, that the language that is used in a lot of historical writing is inaccessible, and oftentimes that's on purpose. I'm sure most of you have heard of the term ivory tower before. So that essentially is saying that the academics are kind of pulling themselves up in a place where only academics belong. And it's funny that a lot of historians kind of lament in a very elitist fashion the lack of historical thinking that's going on, but then there's also not really a strong sense of urgency to provide accurate historical information to a general public. A lot of historians are writing for themselves and to themselves, and they're not really allowing other people to enter into the debate or to the dialogue about history. So Brianna and I take seriously and really hope to foster a sense of historical thinking in all people, and although it might sound a little, I don't know, utopian maybe, that we think that when more people start to think historically, that we can make the world a better place to live in, that we believe that when taught correctly, history will teach virtues necessary to end things like culture wars, to transform the way we think about others, and even in some small way, bring meaningful change to the world. So one of the ways to achieve this is to share these skills that we learn as historians and to not kind of protect them so closely. So as professionally trained historians, we've learned ways to read texts, to analyze events that more people should know how to do. That it shouldn't be exclusive domain of the academically trained historian who kind of sits perched atop of the ivory tower and only writes to and for other historians. And so these skills are really important because a lot of people try to use history, as we have seen from the examples that Brianna gave, because most people are in search of a usable past. But there's not really anything inherently wrong in that. If you think there are some professions that's what they get paid for, so lawyers do that all the time, kind of help achieve different present-minded agendas. But those who only approach history in that way are missing out on the transformative power that the study of the past can have on our lives and our society. And in a world which self-interest, individualism, and even narcissism reign supreme, history forces us to see ourselves as part of a larger human story. It has the potential to humble us. Its careful study has the potential to cultivate civic mindedness and civility as we learn to listen to voices that are different from our own. So really it's about cultural sensitivity. And so really what we'd like to use today is a forum for kind of an idea that Brianna and I have about kind of bridging this gap between academic history and the people. It's called History to the People, and basically, we're removing these barriers, these kind of rhetorical walls that have been established over a long period of time. So this goes back even to the professionalization of history as a discipline in the late 19th, early 20th century, so that we can provide a place for people like you to engage in dialogue, to ask questions about the past, and to walk away with a greater understanding of how a more intimate knowledge of the past can make for a better future. And so I guess a good way to explain what we're doing is to explain what we're not doing. And we think that Wikipedia serves as a really good foil for what we don't want to do. And I'm not trying to kind of lay down this value judgment on Wikipedia, because it has its uses for sure. It's a cool concept, that community sourced information. But in academia, it's either misused or it's just prohibited entirely. So if you were one of my students and you cited Wikipedia as a source on an essay, you're just not going to get an A on that paper. Most high school teachers and professors will not allow their students to use Wikipedia as a source. However, a lot of students continue to use Wikipedia because it's easily digested information that is easy to access. And part of the problem is instead of citing Wikipedia, they just plagiarize. So they're taking this information to be their own when it's clearly not. And even that information might not be accurate because there's not really any standard by which this information is evaluated. So this creates all sorts of problems, not just for students, but for people in general who are just looking to get their, any type of historical information. So history to the people will hopefully fill this kind of gap that there is on really rigorously researched information and creating kind of a space for that for a popular audience to access it. So this information, we hope, by the standards that we set for ourselves, will be taken seriously and it will be appropriate not only for the classroom but also for public consumption.
And so the site, as we're envisioning it, which I don't think we've mentioned, we're planning a February 1st launch date to coincide with the Arizona Centennial. And what the site's kind of going to look like as we're envisioning it is, like Callie said, accessible, academically produced knowledge. So we're going to have daily blog posts, 800 to 1,000 words, on a particular historical topic, to provide kind of that academically produced, authentic information that's really easily accessible, easy to digest, easy to access. And Callie and I will be writing, certainly, and we'll make contributions. We'll also be utilizing our networks at ASU, so getting other grad students, we've talked to some professors to contribute. But we're also really interested in reaching beyond our networks as they are now. And historians like Jill Lepore, who I mentioned, and William Cronin, have a real interest in public engagement. But really, there's no venue like this so far for them to be able to write to a real public audience, an audience that would maybe otherwise have used Wikipedia for information. There's like Jill Lepore, for example. She writes for the New York Times a little bit. She writes heavily for the New Yorker, but the New Yorker is also a specific audience. So we really think that that professors from who we've talked to so far, and that there's really a place for this, and that people will be eager to contribute. But our ultimate goal is that we want people to learn and engage, and so we plan to make our blog posts as accessible as possible. But we also, at the same time, realize that just as a lot of people don't want to sit and read an article in an academic journal, there are going to be some that don't want to sit down and read a 1,000-word blog post either. So we're really invested in experimenting with new media. We have a Kickstarter project in the works to create some videos. We first said history in 5 minutes or less, then moved it down to 3, and now we're talking around 90 seconds. So
Nikki helped us out.
Yeah. So that's something that we're experimenting in. We're really we want to have interactive features. So we're talking to some graphic designers about how we can incorporate different interactive media. But this is a point where because Cali and I are historians, we're really open to suggestions, and we really want to experiment. But I'd say it's not either of ours immediate forte either. So we're really interested in hearing what people have to say, what you think would work really well, what would be helpful. But so that's kind of in brief how we're envisioning the site to look.
Okay, so I know we've already kind of talked about one of the main components of the site, and that would be this academically sourced information written for a popular audience. So content is really important to us in upholding these standards of the academic discipline. But the other, kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but really kind of the main thrust behind why we're doing what we're doing is because we're passionate about fostering this historical thinking, this idea of historical thinking, or maybe thinking critically might be more useful if you're not a historian. Maybe that word is, or that phrase is more useful. But you might be wondering through all of this how you might apply history to your everyday life. You know, how does the Battle of Antietam affect how I sit in Gangplank today? And most of us plan and live in the present, and we're far more concerned with the future than the past. I get that. I'm there too. But the functions of history are just a lot more difficult to define than that. That history is very useful, and it's actually indispensable to the way we live and operate in the world. But the products, because I know a lot of you guys are used to talking in that kind of language, you are in this kind of creative service industry where you're creating products for your clients. The products of historical study are far less tangible and sometimes less immediate than those that stem from other disciplines, like what you're doing or medicine. But the most important way that we can apply history to everyday life is in the ways that it helps us understand other people and other societies. And further, history can even help us understand change and how the world we live in came to be. And so So as I had mentioned before, that we've acquired these kind of tools and skills that we've learned as professionally trained historians. But it's in thinking about how we can translate those kind of things to the general public that's really important to us. And so over the course of however many years we've both been studying history, we've created what we're calling our toolbox, or some people call it a knapsack. You guys all have your own as well. And in our knapsacks or our toolbox, we store these tools that are used, that we've been using in the classroom for so long, but that can also be used in everyday life. And so Brianna and I are going to just discuss 4 of those tools that we find essential to what we do as historians, but that are tools that everybody can use, everybody should be using, as you kind of formulate the way that you view the world, the way that you interact with other people, the way you think about other people, and the way you think about how other people think about the world. So the first tool is context, and you've probably all heard and used that word before. Context is basically the setting for an event. More specifically, it's the political, social, cultural, and economic climate surrounding an event, a person, a place, or an event. And context impacts not only the way we understand the event, but also the way that event was experienced. An interaction of all these kind of complex forces give way to an event, and in order to fully understand the meaning of that event, we need to examine how these forces work. So just a really pertinent example is Gangplank. So we can use Gangplank and look at Gangplank, and it can tell us about shifts in the economic and cultural climate and social practices in the 21st century. So Gangplank, what you guys are doing here, satisfies a need for new ways of thinking about work. And it's emerged out of a greater concern for things like productivity and creativity. So you can't just understand, you have to understand Gangplank not in isolation, but as it relates to these kind of external forces. So that's just kind of a contemporary example, but you can do this with any historical event, person, place. It's really kind of examine these cultural, social, economic, political forces in order to better understand that event. And then also to understand how you're interpreting that event. Your own context is equally as important as understanding the context of the past. And so in order to get at context, you have to interrogate these events. And if you're a CSI fan, maybe this will resonate with you a little bit, but it's like cross-examining or asking questions of a person or an event. So there are theories and practices and assumptions that just become embedded in the way that we see the world. So it's like wearing a pair of, I've probably heard the phrase, rose-tinted glasses. So you just become accustomed to seeing through this, tinted lens, so much so that you don't even recognize the tinted lens anymore. And so in order to interrogate something, you have to take off your glasses, you have to step away from the sources and ask questions about these kind of entrenched understandings that you have and that you carry with you. And so this process, the whole process begins with an analysis and a synthesis of sources. And so for sources, we'll go back to Brianna. She'll explain to us what I mean by that.
Well, what a historian does, utilizing some of the tools and the tactics, the strategies that Kelly talked about, but what a historian really does is interpret the past through a careful analysis of two main types of sources, what we call primary sources and secondary sources. But approaching sources, thinking about how a historian approaches these sources, are skills really with wide applicability, which is what we've been talking about throughout. So primary sources for a historian are the sources that are close to the period in question. They're generally first-hand accounts in some form. Historians often use newspapers, diaries, court cases, but especially in the past few decades, historians have become increasingly creative in thinking about what can we use as a primary source, what can we use as a historical artifact that will shed light on some aspect of the past. So visual images have become increasingly used, as well as cultural artifacts. There's an excellent study at the beginning of the 21st century by a well-known historian, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who used physical artifacts, like a spinning wheel and quilts, and was able to craft this whole narrative about what an investigation of these sources can tell us about this period. But of course, no single source is immune to the past. That's kind of what we've been given at throughout. So what a historian does with these sources is to ask questions of them. For example, in the more traditional sources, who was the author, who was the intended audience, and who was the actual audience? Because sometimes that's a really important distinction. Who the author was intended to reach may be different than who he or she actually reached. And then what is the purpose? And again, what did the author mean? And how was it used? And then along with asking these questions, historians also kind of use this is like what Kai was talking about with the cross-examining. Use a variety of source sets and put them in basically conversation with one another. This raises a whole new set of questions, such as how do certain interpretations or accounts differ? What's missing in this source, not in this source, and why? And are those differences significant? And again, why? So this types of, for me, this is critical to thinking about historical thinking. Yes, historical thinking, it is definitely critical thinking. It's a type of critical thinking, but it's the way in which you approach a source and some level of skepticism isn't exactly the right word, but questioning. And so the uses of the application potential of this is just huge as we approach the texts in the 21st century that later historians, of course, will use as the primary sources to understanding this period. And I think that this is especially critical with our 24-hour media. We have media sources coming at us with the internet from everywhere. So utilizing these tools to digest and interpret information are really critical. The other kind of source set or types of sources that historians use are what we call secondary sources. And secondary sources are basically just what others have written on the subject. So the skill involved in this is the kind of the ability to get at and process someone's argument. And so in academia, we do this exercise called the historiographical essay, where you basically read a lot of different different interpretations of an event or an era, and then you put the authors in dialogue with each other. So that's a really important skill that we develop. But the reason that I think that for Cali and I that aspect of it is so important to what we're trying to do is because history, it reinforces the fact that history is a dialogue. It's a collaborative endeavor, much like kind of the environment that you're creating here at Gameplay, where it's creativity and productivity come through engagement and collaboration. Basically, we learn from each other, and in doing so, we sharpen our own conclusions. So that's really that kind of engagement, collaboration, that real dialogue about history and about different historical interpretations is the type of engagement we're really striving for what we're envisioning for this website.
And so now, hopefully we did that justice, and if you guys have any questions or suggestions, we'd like to entertain those.
I don't know. I've always been amazed at how two sides of an argument can never meet in the middle. In fact, it seems completely verboten to blend both sides and get an accurate picture. I've always imagined a historical site that somehow ran a popular article on some part of history that somebody just releases. And in red, there's a whole section that you can hyperlink to see where they were either misleading or they were just using a biased view on it. It's so funny. I've seen how much people's egos are tied to history, and they're scared to death to learn the truth about a bunch of dead people that they have nothing to do with. Like whenever I was teaching art history or anything like that, or something came up in propaganda, and I tell my class that it was Democrats that started the Ku Klux Klan, they're like, yeah, they don't want to hear that. Or if somebody tries to defend the Republicans for dying for the blacks in the South, and then you say, well, no, they were in the Philippines enslaving them there at the same time. It's just, you can't seem to be able to get this. I just wondered, how do you guys find a way to balance that so you don't just get the truth about the truth or the truth about the truth, and then you're not actually getting any real history, you're just getting a bunch of rhetoric or something?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think that's completely true. One of the things I think that kind of gets at that problem is to really focus on the process of history. Whereas we've talked about, and just bouncing around ideas for this site, having kind of like a Mythbuster series. And because what that addresses is that, because, we very much think that history is a matter of interpretation and debate and dialogue. But at the same time, we've talked a lot about in classes, the fact is that some things are more plausible than others. Not everything, George Washington having a strong stance on socialism really isn't historically plausible. So finding a way, maybe in this historian's toolbox, to talk people through kind of the process by which you utilize evidence and decide what's more plausible than others, and what's a good historical argument. But then the other issue you addressed is that one thing that I think that factchecker.org does a pretty good job of is they go through all the political debates and then kind of analyze each candidate for accuracy. And they're not just talking about historical accuracy, but that's something, especially lightly, that comes up quite a bit. And something that I think that FactChecker does a really good job of is not just saying this is right or this is wrong, but kind of opening the door for nuance. Like this is a technically true argument, but in the way it's positioned, it's deliberately misleading or something like that. And so that's something I would kind of like to engage with in our site as well in some posts. Pick a historical issue. There's so many now that's become a matter of a lot of public debate, political debate, cultural debate. And writing about it, but then also including links to different places that have addressed this issue, like the different purposes this historical event has served, and the different ways in which history has been misused in this debate as well.
And just to kind of get at the root, I think of that problem is the fact that so many people see history as a closed book, as a story that's finished, as facts and figures, rote memorization, what Brianna talked about, what a lot of you may or may not have experienced in a high school history class, which is why you might have a strong aversion to even just talking about history. I think, he's over there with his earbuds in, but he was like, I think that talks on history. So, I mean, it's just getting people to come to a place where they can, and maybe through a process like that, recognize that this is about, that you have to come to the past with a heavy dose of humility, that we're never going to know exactly what happened, and it is a matter of interpretation, and it is a matter of getting as close as you can collaboratively in community to some semblance of the truth, to some semblance of what actually happened in the past. But the history is much more flexible than people believe it is. So I think getting people to come to that place, you have to do that before you can even begin to have an exercise like that you're being able to show people where an argument comes from and how they've been influenced and things like that. My
favorite one that just happened was when Sarah Palin, just off the cuff, talked about Paul Revere's ride.
Oh, and I was tempted to include that as well.
And I ended up having to actually defend her because the people that were instantly throwing their hands in the air about how stupid she was were using Longfellow's poem to quote why what she did, what she said was wrong. And I'm like, she got them out of sequence, but she was actually far more accurate than the people that were criticizing her for being inaccurate. And it was just, and you could not get these ignorant comments to stop. People dig their heels into 12 feet of mud rather than admit they're wrong. They just wanted to attack, and then so it just opened. It was amazing to watch. It was, see, I'm sure you've seen it then.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is kind of going back to an example that you used earlier with the Democrats starting the Ku Klux Klan, and why that's such a just personal problem, because it's like Callie said, we think we understand, we already have our understanding of the past and it's done. But I think it also goes to kind of when we were talking about the tools and context and interrogating, what did it mean to be a Democrat?
Yeah.
In the early 20th century,
120
because
years ago
we understand, yeah, exactly. And so trying to get at it that way, and I think really by asking questions is really the way to get there. What did it mean to be a Democrat? What did it mean to be a Republican? What issues were the most important? What context was it in terms of economics and cultural battles and stuff like that? So kind of trying to open up those kinds of questions and that kind of thinking is really one of our goals.
Just following on that point and what you were saying, I see a huge challenge for you. You want to make this easily accessible, and you're talking about 90-second videos. The more you squeeze it down, the less information you can actually get or give. And history is not something I think we need shrunk down. Because when you say, Democrats started the Ku Klux Klan, those are two hugely emotional things. And yeah, you have to explain who these Democrats were and what the Ku Klux Klan was. Hopefully, maybe we'll get to a point where we can get into a was on that. But when you're talking about bringing it down, that's what Wikipedia does. It brings it down to what a small group of people want to agree on. I mean, we can even talk about like the Kennedy assassination. I mean, there is no history on that. There's reports and there's what different people saw, different people say, but there's no actual history other than the date, where, etc. And by squeezing it all down, I think you're doing a disservice to history.
I'm sorry, can you guys make sure that you are repeating any questions or comments so that we can get into the video?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good luck with that.
I know. I'm not gonna, the essence of the question is what we're trying to achieve going to do a disservice to these questions of the past? And I think you're right. We have a big challenge, but I think the language that you use I mean, we have to be very precise, and we have to, I think another thing is that just a more narrowly defined topics. So rather than talking about the Democratic Party or talking about the Ku Klux Klan, we can talk specifically to that issue. And about, just to address the video thing, one of what we're trying to achieve through the videos is more to drive traffic and to understand that people kind of digest information in different ways, and people learn things better, you know, sometimes visually, sometimes audibly, and also, I mean, attention span, for most of you who are working kind of with the internet, you know how much people are going to read, you know how long somebody's going to watch a video before engagement totally drops off. And so part of the battle is working with that kind of increasingly decreasing attention span of people. And so how can we get the most accurate information to this demographic? Or, I mean, we have a pretty wide demographic that we're trying to reach, which might also be one of our, you know, one of our barriers, not a barrier, but something that we certainly have to address. But I do think that there's a way to do justice to what happened in the past, to be sensitive to people in the way that they learn through this medium. But those are really good points and things that we absolutely have to think about as we move forward.
I think an underlying problem in general is that Americans don't like to think anymore. And so it's not a problem so much of historical thinking, but it's also not thinking about relationships, about their faith, about a lot of different things. And there's so much more data out there, there's so much more information, and it seems like the more information there is, the less thinking and analysis happens. So I think that's always a challenge with what you're trying to do as well, is the loss of thinking capacity.
Okay, so the essence of that question or comment is basically that Americans don't like to think anymore, both historically and about other issues, and how that presents a challenge, I guess, specifically to what we're doing, as well as in general. But I think that's definitely true. I think that one of the things that I've noticed since becoming a history major is that a lot of people really love history now, which is interesting because sometimes they hate it because of how they learn it in school. But when I say I'm a history major, say I'm getting a PhD, people will mention David McCullough, or they'll say, do you watch the History Channel? Or they'll mention historical movies. There's a real, not everyone, but I do think that there's a real interest in history. And I think that, so part of what we want to do is to really take advantage of that, take advantage of people's interest in history. And one of the things we're going to do that we didn't really talk about, but is kind of talk about some historical fiction and stuff on our site, things that really do draw people in, because they're on some level, especially when it's being talked about so much, they're on some level interested in American history. So I think if we can really take advantage of that, tap into that interest, and try to facilitate this kind of thinking specifically about history, I think in our utopian ideals that can really translate to I mean, when I'm talking about the sources and thinking about me, I mean it's really all related. But I think if we can get at it through thinking about history, I think that's we're hoping that that's an important step.
Well, I think this point is very good. And if you can create a site to encourage people to think, not just answer every question for them, but to lead them further to further thinking and to further investigation, maybe that will help that problem.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. I think something that's important to us, and that we understand that success for this will kind of fly or die with that interaction, with that engagement, and allowing people an opportunity for commenting, for kind of wrestling with these issues. And hopefully what we want to convey in everything that we write is that this is a safe place to ask questions and to be in dialogue about these events of the past, these people of the past. And, yeah, just make that a strong component.
What do you guys think of the work of people like James Lowen and others to inspire people into really starting to investigate history again? James Lowen, he did the Lies My Teacher Told Me book, and Everything You've Been Taught Is Wrong, and worked really hard in the black colleges in the South for a while.
So that was, what do we think about him and his work?
Or even more so, like what the type of work he did might have done to facilitate people to be more interested in history.
So the question is, what do we think of, like, I'm sorry,
James Lowen?
James Lowen, okay, I'm familiar with this book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. He actually was at ASU, was it in last spring? Or maybe in the fall. It was my first year of school, so I think all time was. But yeah, he was actually just here, and I have not read the book, but I'm really sympathetic to the project which, as I very generally understand it, is interrogating how we teach history and how we learn history, and that's one of the things that actually historical memory in that way, in terms of education, is something I'm really interested in. Like, it's just thinking through, excuse me, through kind of potential things we would want to do on the site. I think a lot about, like, I do 20th century history, so thinking about ways that, like, the civil rights movement is taught, and how, like, what it means that Martin Luther King has become the face of the civil rights movement, when at the time it was much more contentious who was the leader. But there are leaders that I think that we're less comfortable with teaching, who had messages that we're less comfortable with teaching. And I think that's really significant to think about how various interests and how our comfort level really do impact how we teach something like the civil rights movement, which is, just 40, 50 years old. So I don't know if I'm answering your question directly, because I haven't read it, but I'm really, from what I know, I'm really sympathetic to that kind of project, like really interrogating what's involved in teaching history and learning it.
You'll get a kick out of it because he talks about how he collects history books, and he has this huge volume of like 15 or 20 different history books, and he said the combined weight was like 206 pounds. And then he'll talk about a real contentious point in history, and then detail like how each of the books either completely ignore it, or they make it antiseptic, or they put such a positive spin that our government is just the greatest thing ever. Like his theory, his thesis is kind of like, the blacks were enslaved, white men freed them and gave them their big chance, and then they blew it, so the government had to kind of wait till they got their act together, and then once everyone else in society went bad, the government rescued everyone and passed these laws. And he's like, that, if you look at, that's how history books often get, they kind of paint the picture, like academically, and so he talks all about it, how the children he's taught reacted to it, how the finer details made a bigger difference in people's lives.
Well, and adding American Indians to that thesis is really interesting as well, because a professor I'm working for is doing a project where he's looking at textbooks and the way in which, like, westward expansion and the extent to which I was just astounded by today in recent textbooks, the extent to which American Indians aren't part of that process besides a couple of major battles. And so that's just, it's interesting to think about that as well, and what's at stake in teaching history in that way.
I just want to ask a little bit more about, like, who you're hoping to reach with this, particularly because the way this is kind of coalescing in my mind is that the sort of people who would really benefit from this kind of thinking are going to be the sort of people who are hardest to reach in these methods. I mean, like, especially if it's going to be, if people in their spare time reading up on history and perspectives and theories and histories, you're already attracting the type of person who's probably pretty open-minded and sees the world as an inherently complex place. I mean, how do you work with those people who are personally and emotionally motivated to misconstrue history, not because they're bad people, but because it's, you know, that American history is a certain way has such great personal significance to them. I mean, I guess this gets back to kind of what some of the other questions that have been asked, but fundamentally what I'm wondering is, like, who are you hoping to reach? And assuming that you're trying to reach some people who could really benefit from thinking about history as a more complex thing, how do you persuade those people to spend the time to read or watch what you're giving them?
Okay, so the question is a little bit about audience and who we're trying to reach, and kind of the problems that kind of who would be most immediately attracted to what we're doing are probably the people that don't need to hear our message. And I would say to that we want to start small, that even if it's just one classroom, if it's one K through 12 teacher that we're working with that is kind of showing their students a new way to get information, new place to get information, and I guess, you know, the simple message in it is that there is no one place to get information. And so yeah, I mean, I guess as we hopefully grow, those are challenges that we will face. But yeah, I guess the simplest answer is that we just, if it's you know, 20, 15-year-olds, then that's okay. That's good enough for us right now. And yeah, that's just where we're going to start.
And kind of expanding on that, so like you mentioned, we're talking with different people about kind of doing a case study or trying it out in a classroom in different ways, working with teachers to figure out how we could do that locally. And that's also, I mean, we want to be kind of an off-the-web that also kind of aligns with our desire to be an off-the-web presence as well as, like, in the community as well as on the web. But I also think that down the road, something that we're hoping is that it'll, for those that, I mean, just like students Google things and go to the Wikipedia page, that we can, if we can even just draw.
It's a big vision. What? So it's a big vision.
Right. No, but I think that's how. I think that the people that would be using the site regularly for the kind of engagement that you're talking about are the type, exactly like you said, that don't that need the message less, we'll say. But those that somehow stumble on it for a post. But I agree with Callie. I mean, we're really talking about getting involved in classrooms right now and with local schools and seeing how we can work with them, and also seeing what the teachers want. Like how can our website help them? How can in the classroom in what kind of in what ways can we organize it so that they feel like it'll be helpful for students if they're going to be directing students in that way.
And one more way in which we hope that, you know, we can reach our target audience, the people who need to kind of understand this more complex approach to the past, is that we want our colleagues, so our professors, our classmates, to be able to point their family and friends to this type of website. So if you're, you know, in this kind of contentious debate with your uncle from Illinois about Republican values, I guess that might be an opportunity to kind of say, well, here, this is a good place to kind of really interrogate the perspective that you're coming from, or there's just a new way to think about you. So just kind of being a place that people who do think critically about the world can share with people who maybe need to have that conditioned in them more, you know, to be encouraged more to think that way.
I think your Mythbusters idea is probably a good one to approach the problem that he's talking about, which is, and also digesting information down into a very short snippet by just taking a topic that someone can easily understand and then addressing it point by point. But with your site, how do you plan to engage the audience? How do you plan to make it a collaborative experience rather than sort of just another information site?
Okay, so the question is how do we plan to make the site, to foster engagement on the site? How do we plan to make it more than just another place to gather information? And that's something that we're still very much discussing, and that's something that like we have a lot of down the road ideas for, especially when thinking about K through 12 education and stuff like that. We have, I mean, we're very much interested in doing forums and that kind of stuff. And obviously you can comment on all the blogs, but that's not really the type of engagement we're really looking for. I mean, that's something, of course. And but we've talked about doing different forums. The issue there is you have to have kind of some level of traffic first to even have a forum that's meaningful. So I think we're still really brainstorming on that front. Yeah.
But it's certainly something we need to think about as we move forward. So it's not just my dad commenting on the forum.
You know, it might be interesting if some of your articles it began with something like, if you're on the right, you might hate this. If you're on the left, you might hate this. You know, and it's the same article, and it just shows how you can read one thing from a different perspective, get two different things, and have a completely different bias, and all you've done is read words.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're out of time. So thank you guys very much.